Welcome back to Reddit Audio Tales. Today's story dives into a workplace friendship gone terribly wrong. What began as casual conversations and friendly lunches ended in HR investigations, social isolation, and painful regret. Was she justified in her actions? Or did she ruin a good man's life over a misunderstanding? Let's find out. I'm Natalie, I'm 29, and this whole mess started because I tried to protect myself and ended up becoming the office villain. So I work at this company doing paperwork and customer stuff. Nothing exciting, but it pays my rent and my car payment. There's this guy Donovan who's been there longer than me, maybe 2 years before I started, and he works in a different area, but we're on the same floor. He's one of those guys who's just naturally friendly with everyone. Always saying good morning, holding doors, asking how your weekend was, the type that makes small talk by the coffee machine and actually remembers what you tell him. And honestly, I thought we had this really good friendship thing going, like we'd eat lunch together sometimes. He'd remember little things I mentioned about my life, and we just had this easy way of talking that made work less boring. I'm not gonna lie, there were times I wondered if maybe he was interested in something more than friendship, but I kept it professional because dating people you work with is messy and I actually needed this job. But here's what nobody understands about the whole situation. There were these moments where I felt like he was getting a little too comfortable with our friendship, like he'd lean in really close when we talked, or put his hand on my shoulder when he was making a point, and it always made me feel weird. But I didn't want to be that girl who makes everything about harassment. I mean, he seemed like a genuinely nice guy, and I didn't want to ruin our working relationship over something that might just be in my head. Plus, all our other coworkers loved him. He was like the golden boy, who everyone thought was so helpful and considerate. So, I just told myself I was overthinking it and tried to keep things normal between us. We'd still eat lunch together sometimes, usually with other people around, and everything seemed fine on the surface. But looking back now, I can see there were signs that he might have been reading our friendship differently than I was. Like, he'd always offer to help me with work stuff, even when I didn't ask, or he'd remember details about conversations we had weeks ago, and sometimes I'd catch him looking at me from across the office in a way that felt a little too intense. I started getting this feeling that maybe he thought our friendship was heading somewhere romantic, but I never said anything because I didn't want to assume and make things awkward between us. And honestly, part of me liked the attention because it's nice to have someone at work who actually cares about your day and remembers what you tell them about your life outside of this place. But there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that maybe I was encouraging something I shouldn't be encouraging, even though I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just being friendly back to him, the same way he was being friendly to me. I mean, what was I supposed to do? Be rude to the nicest guy in the office? Everyone would have thought I was completely crazy if I suddenly started being cold to him for no reason. So I kept our friendship going the way it was, but I started being a little more careful about not sending mixed signals that might give him the wrong idea. I'd make sure to mention other guys I was talking to, or I'd include other people in our conversations more often just to keep things from getting too personal or intimate. But Donovan never seemed to pick up on those hits. Or maybe he just chose to ignore them because he liked our dynamic the way it was. Either way, everything seemed normal and manageable until that day, when everything went completely sideways and I had to make a choice that changed everything between us forever. So this whole nightmare started during one of our regular lunch breaks in the office eating area. We have this little space with tables and a microwave, nothing fancy, and a bunch of us usually eat there together instead of going out and spending money we don't have. I was sitting at my usual table with Donovan and a few other people from different departments eating this turkey sandwich I brought from home when suddenly I took too big of a bite and it got stuck in my throat. Like, really stuck. I tried to cough it up, but nothing was happening and I started panicking because I literally couldn't breathe at all. I was making these weird choking sounds and grabbing at my throat, and everyone at the table just froze for a second because nobody knew what to do in that situation. Then Donovan jumped up from his chair and got behind me, and I heard him say something about knowing how to do the Heimlich maneuver from some training he had. Now here's the thing that everyone keeps missing when they talk about what happened next. I was already feeling uncomfortable about how close we'd been getting lately, and suddenly he's pressed up against me from behind with his arms wrapped around me in this really intimate way. I know he was trying to save my life. I'm not stupid, but in that moment when I was already scared and couldn't think straight, having him that close to me just felt wrong somehow. I could feel his whole body against mine, his chest against my back, and yet I could definitely feel other parts of him too when he was doing those compressions on my stomach. I know it probably wasn't intentional. I know he was just trying to help me breathe again, but it felt invasive and uncomfortable in a way that I can't really explain to people who weren't there experiencing it. Like, imagine you're already feeling weird about someone's boundaries with you, and then suddenly they're touching you in the most intimate way possible, even if it's for a good reason that everyone can see. The maneuver worked. Whatever was stuck came flying out and landed on the table, and I could breathe again. Everyone was cheering and clapping and saying what a hero Donovan was, and he kept asking if I was okay and if I needed water or anything, but I just felt so overwhelmed and embarrassed and confused about how the whole thing made me feel that I couldn't even look at him or anyone else. I just nodded and walked straight to the bathroom without saying anything because I needed a minute to process what just happened and why I felt so weird about it. In the bathroom, I was shaking and trying to calm down, but I couldn't stop thinking about how wrong the whole felt, even though I knew logically that he had literally saved my life. I kept replaying it in my head, the way he grabbed me, how close he was, how long it seemed to take, and how everyone was watching us, and I started wondering if maybe he enjoyed it more than he should have, or if I was just being paranoid because I was already feeling weird about our friendship and the way he'd been acting around me. I stayed in the bathroom for like 10 minutes trying to figure out what I was feeling and whether I was being crazy or if my instincts were trying to tell me something important that I shouldn't ignore. When I finally came back out, Donovan tried to check on me again, asking if I was sure I was okay and if maybe I wanted to talk about what happened, but I just told him I was fine and went back to my desk. I couldn't concentrate on work for the whole time, so I kept thinking about what happened and whether I should say something to someone about how it made me feel, or if I should just let it go and pretend everything was normal. Part of me felt guilty for even questioning his motives when he literally saved my life and everyone saw him do it, but another part of me felt like something about the whole situation was off in a way I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. I went home that night and couldn't stop thinking about what happened during lunch. I kept replaying the whole thing over and over in my head, and the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable and violated I felt about the whole experience. I called my sister to talk through it because she's always been good at helping me figure out my feelings, and when I described how it felt to have Donovan pressed against me like that, she said it sounded like he might have taken advantage of the situation somehow. She pointed out that maybe a trained professional would have handled it differently, or that maybe he lingered longer than necessary, and suddenly all these doubts I was having started making more sense. She said that just because someone saves your life doesn't give them the right to make you feel uncomfortable, and that my feelings about what happened were valid regardless of his intentions. I barely slept that night because I kept wondering if I was overreacting to the whole thing, or if my gut feeling was trying to tell me something important that I needed to pay attention to. The next morning at work, I tried to act normal and go about my day like nothing had changed, but every time I saw Donovan, I felt weird and uncomfortable about it. He kept trying to check on me and make sure I was okay, which should have been sweet and caring, but it just felt like he was trying to get close to me again and create some kind of special bond between us because of what happened. During our morning break, he cornered me by the coffee machine and started talking about the incident, saying he was really glad he could help and asking if I wanted to talk about how I was feeling. The way he was standing so close to me and speaking in this low, intimate voice made me feel like he was trying to create some kind of romantic moment between us, and that's when I knew I had to do something to protect myself. I spent my lunch break thinking about the whole situation, and I realized that if I didn't speak up about how uncomfortable the whole thing made me feel, he might think what happened was okay or worse, that I actually liked it and wanted more contact like that. I decided I needed to report it to HR, not because I wanted to get him in trouble or ruin his reputation, but because I needed to protect myself and make sure there was a record of what happened in case he tried anything else in the future. When I went to the HR office that afternoon, I was really nervous about how to explain the situation without sounding crazy. I told the woman there that during the choking incident, Donovan had been inappropriately close to me and that I felt his private areas against my body in a way that made me really uncomfortable and violated. I explained that while I understood he was trying to help save my life, the way he did it felt invasive and that I was concerned about his true intentions behind his actions. The HR representative asked me a bunch of questions about our previous interactions and whether I'd ever felt uncomfortable with him before this incident, and I told her about some of the things that had been bothering me, how he'd lean in too close when we talked, how he'd touch my shoulder unnecessarily, how he'd stare at me sometimes from across the office. When I laid it all out like that for someone else to hear, it really did sound like a pattern of inappropriate behavior that was building up to something more serious. She took detailed notes and said they'd have to do a full investigation, which meant talking to witnesses and getting Donovan's side of the story. I asked her to keep it as confidential as possible because I didn't want to become office gossip or have everyone talking about me, but she said they had to follow their standard procedures for these types of complaints. The whole thing made me feel sick to my stomach because I knew people were going to think I was absolutely crazy for reporting someone who had just saved my life, but I also felt like I was finally standing up for myself after letting things slide for way too long. The next few days at work were absolutely horrible and uncomfortable in ways I never expected. Word got around pretty quickly that there was some kind of HR investigation happening, and even though they're supposed to keep things confidential, everyone knew it had something to do with me and Donovan somehow. I could feel people staring at me and whispering when I walked by their desks, and I heard through the office grapevine that Donovan had been called in to give his statement about what happened. The worst part was seeing how confused and hurt he looked whenever we passed each other in the hallway or break room. Part of me felt bad for him, because he probably never expected this kind of reaction to saving someone's life, but I kept reminding myself that I was protecting myself and that his feelings weren't my responsibility to manage. My sister kept telling me over the phone that I did the right thing, and that men like him count on women feeling too guilty to speak up when they cross boundaries. HR interviewed all the other people who were at lunch that day when the choking happened, and I could tell from their faces when they came back that they all thought I was being completely ridiculous about the whole thing. This one girl, Jessica, who's always been kind of judgmental anyway, actually rolled her eyes at me when she came back from her interview with HR. I heard her in the bathroom later telling someone that I was making a huge deal out of nothing, and that Donovan was just trying to save my life like any decent person would. Like, excuse me, but she wasn't the one who had to feel his body pressed against her back while everyone watched and cheered. Easy for her to judge when she wasn't in my position and didn't have to experience what I experienced. The whole office started treating me differently after that week. People who used to be friendly with me and include me in conversations started keeping their distance, and I could tell they all thought I was some kind of troublemaker who couldn't handle a simple life-saving gesture without making it into something dirty. Even my work friends started acting weird and awkward around me, like they were afraid I might report them for something stupid too, if they said the wrong thing. It was so frustrating because nobody was trying to understand my side of things or acknowledge that what I experienced was valid and real. They all just saw the surface level, guy saves girl, girl reports guy, without thinking about all the context and the uncomfortable history between us that led up to this moment. Meanwhile, Donovan was getting treated like some kind of martyr by everyone in the office. People kept talking about how unfair it was that he was being investigated for doing a good deed, and I heard someone say they hoped he wouldn't get in trouble for being a gentleman and helping a coworker. I wanted to scream because being a gentleman doesn't mean pressing your body against someone longer than necessary or creating weird, intimate moments afterward when you're supposedly just being helpful, but I couldn't say any of that without looking like even more of a villain in everyone's eyes. After about a week of investigation and interviews, HR called me back in and said they weren't finding any evidence of intentional, inappropriate behavior on Donovan's part, but they were going to have a conversation with him about workplace boundaries and appropriate contact. They also suggested that maybe I should consider requesting a transfer to a different floor if I felt uncomfortable continuing to work in close proximity to him every day. I couldn't believe they were basically suggesting that I should be the one to move and change my work situation when I was supposed to be the victim in this whole thing, but I could tell they just wanted the whole incident to go away quietly, without any more drama. After the HR investigation wrapped up with basically no consequences for anyone, things got so much worse instead of better, like I thought they would. Donovan went from being this friendly, chatty guy who always made time to talk to me and ask about my day to treating me like I literally didn't exist in the same building as him. And I'm not talking about just being a little distant or awkward. I'm talking about full-on ignoring me like I was completely invisible to him. If I walked into the break room and he was already there getting coffee or heating up his lunch, he'd immediately finish whatever he was doing and leave without even acknowledging that I'd entered the room. If we ended up in the elevator together by accident, he'd stare at the floor or his phone the entire time like I wasn't even standing right next to him. The few times I tried to say something normal like "good morning" or "how's your day going," he'd give me this blank, cold stare and either not respond at all or just nod slightly before walking away as fast as possible. It was honestly more uncomfortable and hurtful than when I thought he was being too friendly with me, because at least then he was treating me like a human being who deserved basic respect. Now I felt like a ghost wandering around the office that nobody could see or hear. What made the whole situation even worse was that everyone else started following his lead in how they treated me. Since Donovan was so well liked by everyone, and they all thought I'd wronged him somehow by reporting him, they started treating me the same cold way he was. People who used to include me in lunch plans and after-work happy hours stopped inviting me to anything. Conversations would literally stop when I walked up to a group of coworkers who were talking and laughing together. I'd overhear people making plans for weekend activities or birthday parties, but nobody ever asked if I wanted to join anymore. Even people I thought were my friends. It was like I'd been completely blacklisted from the entire social circle at work just because I stood up for myself and reported something that made me uncomfortable. The isolation was starting to really get to me mentally, and I began to wonder if maybe I'd overreacted to the whole choking situation and blown everything out of proportion. I found myself analyzing everything that happened over and over again, questioning whether I'd misinterpreted Donovan's actions or turned something innocent into something sinister in my head. Maybe he really was just trying to save my life in the most effective way he knew how, and I'd turned it into something sexual when it wasn't meant to be that way at all. Maybe all those other times when I felt uncomfortable with his behavior were just in my head, and he was genuinely being friendly, without any ulterior motives or inappropriate intentions. The doubt was eating away at me every single day, especially when I had to sit alone at lunch watching him laugh and joke with everyone else like nothing had ever happened between us. I tried talking to Jessica one day to see if maybe she could help bridge the gap between me and everyone else, or at least explain to people that I wasn't trying to be malicious, but she just shrugged and said that maybe I should have thought about the consequences before I threw Donovan under the bus for no good reason. She said everyone thought it was pretty messed up that I'd try to ruin a good guy's reputation over something so innocent and heroic, and that if I wanted things to go back to normal, I should probably apologize to him publicly and admit I was wrong. But the thing is, even though I was starting to have serious doubts about my decision, I still remembered how uncomfortable and violated I felt in that moment when it happened, and I didn't think I should have to apologize for having feelings about something that happened to my own body. After weeks of this cold treatment and social isolation, I finally decided I couldn't take the hostile work environment anymore. I needed to have a direct conversation with Donovan to try to clear the air between us, even if it meant admitting that maybe I'd handled the whole situation wrong from the beginning. I waited until most people had left for the day and approached him while he was packing up his desk to go home. I started by saying I wanted to talk about what happened and maybe find a way to move forward professionally, but he just looked at me with this expression that was completely different from any way he'd ever looked at me before in all the time we'd worked together. It wasn't angry exactly, but it was cold and distant and final in a way that made me realize he wasn't the same person I thought I knew before all this happened. He told me very calmly and matter-of-factly that he understood I had to do what I felt was right at the time, but that he also had to protect himself now from any future accusations or problems. He said that after being accused of inappropriate behavior for literally saving someone's life, he couldn't risk having any kind of personal relationship with me ever again because he never knew when I might decide that something else he did was wrong or inappropriate. The way he said it was so final and definitive, like he'd already written me off completely as a person, and there was absolutely nothing I could say to change his mind or repair the damage. I tried to explain that I never meant for things to go as far as they did, that I was just confused and scared after what happened and maybe I overreacted, but he cut me off and said it didn't matter what I meant because the damage to his reputation was already done. He said that from now on he'd only interact with me when it was absolutely necessary for work purposes, and even then he'd make sure there were always witnesses around so there couldn't be any misunderstandings about his behavior or intentions. Then he said something that really stung and made me feel terrible. He told me that he'd learned a valuable lesson about being careful who you try to help, and that next time someone was in trouble or danger, he'd think twice before getting involved, because you never know how people might twist your good intentions. The way he said it made me feel like I'd not only ruined our friendship and my work relationships, but potentially put other people at risk, because now he'd be hesitant to help anyone in an emergency situation. As I walked back to my desk feeling defeated, I realized that everything had completely backfired on me. Instead of protecting myself and setting appropriate boundaries like I thought I was doing, I'd ended up more isolated and uncomfortable than I'd ever been before. I'd lost the one person at work who actually seemed to care about me as a person. I'd made enemies out of people who used to be friendly with me, and I'd created this toxic environment where everyone saw me as the villain in the story instead of someone who was just trying to protect herself. And the worst part was that now I wasn't even sure I'd been right to report him in the first place. Maybe my sister was wrong in her advice. Maybe I had completely overreacted to the situation. Maybe I destroyed a genuinely good person's reputation over absolutely nothing. Over the next few months, things never got any better at all. Donovan kept his word about only interacting with me in a professional capacity, and even then he'd send emails instead of talking to me in person whenever it was possible to avoid face-to-face contact. The other coworkers continued to freeze me out of social activities and treat me like I had some kind of contagious disease. And I eventually started eating lunch alone in my car just to avoid the awkward tension and hostile looks in the cafeteria. I applied for transfers to other departments within the company, but somehow word about the HR incident had spread throughout the building and nobody wanted to deal with the drama and potential liability of having me on their team. Eventually, I realized I had to start looking for a completely new job because the work environment had become so hostile and uncomfortable that I dreaded coming in every single day. And you know what the really messed up part of this whole thing is? I found out later through office gossip that Donovan had been promoted to a supervisor position in his department, and everyone was talking about how well-deserved it was because he was such a stand-up guy who always looked out for his coworkers and did the right thing. Meanwhile, I was stuck trying to explain to potential employers why I was leaving my current job after such a short time. Trying to figure out how to spin the story without making myself sound like a problem employee who causes drama wherever she goes. Looking back now, I still don't know if I was right or wrong about the whole situation, but I definitely know that speaking up and reporting him cost me way more than just staying quiet and dealing with my discomfort would have. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just said thank you for saving my life and moved on instead of making it into this huge thing that ended up hurting everyone involved, including myself most of all.